you're on the home straight now. This is the last one in this session. It's been really very interesting to hear all the other speakers today, because we operate outside of a convention for older people, and so particularly I was interested in Alex's presentation. We have very similar powers and duties in our enabling legislation, and one commission operates with the UNCRC and the other operates completely outside of a convention, but obviously with due regard to principles. So we, in our enabling legislation, we've been in operation now since 2011. We pay attention to the UN principles for older people, and within that we think they're incredibly useful in setting the scene and in setting out how older people should be worked with, but also how they should be empowered to drive the agenda. But we do think there are lots of interesting aspects of these principles, because when you get into the nitty-gritty, of course, it's always in the nuance. So whilst there's a principle, for example, for independence that appears to wish to drive that older people should live independently, and the Transforming Your Care agenda seems to be promoting that idea further and further. But the real lived experience of that is very different for older people if it means that they are alone in their own homes, provided with a package of care that doesn't include support for social interaction or befriending or anything else. So it's always in, as we've said before in this discussion today, it's always in the balance of these human rights. So whilst others this afternoon have talked about the philosophical and ideological need for a convention, I want to look really specifically at the issues and challenges that are faced by older people in Northern Ireland. As a pragmatist, and particularly as a deliverer of services to older people, I've reflected very much on the need for a convention, and we've discussed it a lot in the office, mostly in preparation for this event, I have to say. And it's turned up some very interesting thought processes and some very interesting internal discussions about how we've dealt with it. I was particularly interested in John talking earlier on about normative gaps, and then I think it was Laura who brought up the issue of perhaps, I know Brona spoke about a different approach to conventions, but particularly the big gap here is around discrimination and ageism, which I'll go on to in a moment. But we're in a developed country, we're part of the UK, there's a very broad framework of legal rights and legislation underpinning all of that, and there's no doubt that it's not the case for millions of older people across the world. So, looking at ageism, there's a broad narrative about older people, and you see it in the media all the time, that they're lovely and we should have them, but because they cost too much, they're very expensive, and that is simply not true, and it's not fair. The Commissioner set out in her first 4-year term to put out evidence that wholly disproves that position, and we've done that. In the next 50 years, older people in Northern Ireland will make a net contribution of £50 billion to the economy. Now that's net of all the benefits that they'll receive and of all the projected costs of their health care. So it is simply not true that older people are a cost to society in Northern Ireland. It's also very common that older people come across arbitrary age discrimination. That's from service delivery, and particularly in the health and social care field, so we make a decision that somebody needs a different set of services when they're over 60, for example. And the point at the very bottom of that is one that is coming to us a lot at the moment, where people who are living with particular needs, assessed needs for care, and particularly health care, are finding it very difficult that when they reach 60, suddenly they enter an elderly programme as opposed to a people with disabilities programme, and very often they find that the services that they were enjoying are not available to them anymore. So it's that type of arbitrary age discrimination that we would see Age Goods, Facilities and Services directly tackling. Broadly, services are not designed and delivered in Northern Ireland with the participation of older people. We don't know how many times we've come across services now that are designed and delivered without older people having been consulted with at all or in any meaningful way. And we're particularly disturbed about the fact that a lot of services, regulated services like domiciliary care or other elements of healthcare, are provided to older people, and they're not involved at all in the regulation and inspection of those services. So they're never asked, is this service good enough for you? Now, we certainly see a convention on older people's rights tackling issues of discrimination, but these are really the ones that we think are most pertinent for people in Northern Ireland. And as I said before, that's not the case across the world. I'm going to repeat very slightly what John said earlier on. You know, who is old? What does that mean? Even in our own legislation, it's recognised that certain minority ethnic groups will have much lower longevity. And so being old in those populations is a different thing than being old in the general population. And old is not the same no matter what age you are. And as John said, you know, the lived experience of being 60 is very, very different from the lived experience of being 112 and getting a hip replacement. So, I mean, we were delighted last week to see someone of such advanced age being served so well by the health service. And I was particularly heartened by the doctor who said, I have lots of patients who are too ill for a hip replacement, but I don't have any who are too old. So that's something we would like to see far more of. And also then this idea that ageing is about health, which is it's a nonsense. Ageing is a progression of the human condition. It's just your chronological number. It's not really determining how you are going to experience life. And even within that, and with the health services that we have, a lot of the age associated conditions are completely manageable, and we can cope with them well into our advanced years. So I've just put at the very end there about existing rights instruments applying to everyone, but I did note that John mentioned, and I was going to mention too, that age isn't listed as a reason why people shouldn't be discriminated against in the rights instruments that exist, and I think that that's really where the gap lies. So looking at excuse me, looking at the various tests that you would want to apply to any convention for older people, they're very much, as Alex has outlined, and I feel like I am repeating a lot of what has gone before here, because Alex has said that all of these tests have been met by the UNCRC in her experience of working with children and younger people. And I think that those are definitely tests that you would want to apply to any convention for older people. But I also support John's position that you'd have to be very, very clear about what it is that you're trying to tackle with older people. And then challenges for implementation and avoiding the duplication of existing rights. One of the things I think I was very pleased to hear about from Brona this morning was the extent to which people with disabilities were included in the development of a convention for the rights of people with disabilities, and you would want to see exactly the same thing in a convention for older people. The Commissioner is keen to see the enhancement of the protection of older people who would be receiving care, the raising of minimum standards and consistent approaches, and the attainment of an internationally accepted standard of care provision. We'd also like to see a right to freedom from violence and abuse. The Commissioner here has called for a standalone bill, an adult safeguarding legislation, that would sit alongside the mental capacity bill to look at the rights of older people to be protected from the risk of harm where there is still capacity. And certainly in the 200 live cases that we deal with all the time in the Commission, very, very many of those would fall into that safeguarding category where older people are at risk of harm from everyone. The other thing we'd like to see is a freedom from discrimination, and we've broadly welcomed aged goods facilities and services, albeit we recognise the limits of its scope, and we would be very hopeful that it would improve things a great deal for older people in Northern Ireland. So it's a challenging task, to introduce new and defined and clear human rights protections that are not already outlined in statute in the developed world. Many will argue that there's no need for a convention, and I think that argument has been discussed at least today. The contrary position the Commissioner would take is that we have an opportunity to introduce specific human rights protections for older people that would clearly define their key rights. The opportunity, both locally and on an international level, gives legislators and government the chance to set out a framework of protection that would enhance and change the lives of older people. So I'm going to skip over slide 5 and go straight to the case study. Just wanted to show you the kinds of things that we hear about in relation to older people. And this one is not it's not a common complaint, but it's certainly not the only instance of it that we've heard. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but in relation to your rights when it comes to living in a care home, if you are not a self-funder, so if you're not paying for the totality of your care, then the contract for your care is between the trust, the health trust, and the care home provider. And within that then, the older person is largely unprotected. So we have heard of a number of cases now where residents, and some of them very elderly, some very much in need of full-time health and social care support, are resident in a care home, and because maybe a family member isn't happy with the standard of care that's provided, or maybe they are just a particularly difficult consumer, care managers appear to now be exercising the right to evict older people simply because they don't want to deal with the family. And the older person doesn't have very many legal rights. They certainly have far fewer legal rights than if they owned their own home or if they were renting under a tenancy agreement. So we have attended a series of meetings on individual cases, and we're looking at this as a sort of theme moving forward, because we're very concerned that older people's human rights are not being protected. But that's a right that would probably exist in the Universal Declaration. It's not something that we think would be assisted greatly by a bespoke convention for the rights of older people. So in conclusion, today has been really interesting for us to look at the practical impact of a convention on the lives of older people, and certainly we're going away learning far more than we knew when we got here, so thank you very much for that. There is a need to continue the discussion to ensure that existing rights deficits are corrected and that current protections are enhanced. The Commissioner believes that it's in keeping with her principal duty to promote the interests of older people, that existing rights are protected to as high a standard as possible. Thank you.